come to you from our historic chamber right in the heart of Durham City. The cathedral is right behind me, and I look at a sea, fortunately, of empty pews, but of plenty of people sitting comfortably in their homes to watch this debate. And what stellar lineup we have for you tonight. On the proposition, we have Peter Tatchell. He's originally from Australia. He's a human rights campaigner, particularly known being an LGBT rights champion. And he recently argued in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests that the monarchy had an element of institutional racism. Graham Smith, he's the CEO of The Public, which is a think tank and a pressure group which argues in favour, as the name would suggest, of a republic in the UK. On the opposition, we have Robert Lacey, a historian and author of Battle of Brothers, which is about the relationship between Princes Harry and William. And as I'm sure we'll know from our screens, Netflix's The Crown. Robert was also a consultant to that TV programme. And joining him on the opposition, stellar debater from the Durham Union itself, and our former sponsorship secretary, Tamara Celeste Harrington, will be the final proposition speaker. The way tonight is going to work is that our speakers will give a 5-minute opening statement. We'll then open the floor to questions. I have some questions, and we'll put those different questions to the panel to answer, and hopefully go from there for what I hope will be a fruitful debate. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Peter Tatchell to open the case for the proposition. Thank you, Peter. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President, and everyone who is joining us tonight. The proposition we have before us is that after Megxit, is the royal family still fit for purpose? My first reaction was, after Megxit? I don't think Megxit has got anything to do with it. The fitness or otherwise the royal family is irrespective of Megxit. And then, of course, the other part of the proposition was, is the royal family still fit for purpose? My response is, was it ever really fit for purpose? Let's just ask, what is the purpose of the royal family? And I find it very hard to come up with a credible, plausible answer. What does the royal family achieve? Well, of course, many people will say, oh, well, it's a great boost for tourism. But let's not forget that the Royal Palace of Versailles in France has far greater tourist numbers than any royal palace in Britain. And it seems to survive entirely wonderfully without any royals present. If we look here in Britain, Legoland is a few miles from Windsor Castle. It has infinitely more tourist visitors than Windsor Castle and the royal family there. So I think what the royal family actually achieves for Britain, I think, is a very tenuous, ambiguous and questionable degree of achievement. If we go further and just look at other countries, it's very clear there are many other countries around the world that get along just fine without a royal family. They don't need it. It doesn't add anything. They function as effective democracies without a royal family. So the question is, why do we need it? What is it uniquely about Britain that makes us need our royal family? And of course, we also have to ask, is monarchy, which is really a relic of feudalism before, is it really compatible with democracy? Is it right that we have an unelected head of state over whom we have no power of control, we have no influence? They can do what they will. They may be very good at their job, they may be very bad at their job, but either way, there's nothing we can do about it. Now, I think that this issue is not about the personality of the individual members of the royal family. This is about the institution. It's about whether Britain wants to be a truly 21st century nation without the feudal hangovers of monarchy. We look at the monarchy, it's a very, very expensive business. You know, there's a often quoted figure that it costs us all about 67 pence a year or something like that. But of course, when you factor in all the hidden costs of monarchy, it's, I think, well, Graham will correct me, I think it's probably more in excess of £300 million a year, which is not cheap. Just look at the number of royal palaces. There are 6 royal palaces and residences. Does the royal family really need 6? I think at the last count, there are about 700 servants that the royals have. You know, again, is that really necessary? It seems a very bloated and extravagant royal family, which even by comparison to other many European royal families is much more expensive and puts a much greater weight upon the taxpayer. We also need to look at the fact that so much of the land seized, lands owned by the royals, the royal estates and so on, so much of that land that they have ownership or control of or influence over was land that was effectively stolen. So, for example, you take the Duchy of Cornwall. It came about as a result of English conquest of Cornwall. And that land, to me, really belongs to the people of Cornwall and should be for their benefit, not for the benefit of the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall. If we look at the Royal Art Collection, it's fabulous. But we really, that people, we own it. Yet we're not allowed to see it. Most of it's hidden away in the vaults and it never sees the light of day. And these are all elements of why monarchy and the royal family are so out of touch with modern Britain. The egalitarian democratic nature of our modern society, the ethos of equality for all, is not compatible with the royals. The final point I'd make is that, of course, the Queen is our head of state, and Prince Charles will eventually be. But is that really the way we want to organize the highest office in the land? That it happens by accident of birth into one particular very rich and privileged family? I think the same role could be better fulfilled and much more cheaply fulfilled by a democratically elected head of state. I'm not thinking about a president like Trump or Macron with executive powers. I'm thinking about the low-cost, purely ceremonial presidents like they have in Ireland and Germany. That's the kind of model I'd like to see. And so I think today, in 2020, the royal family is not fit for purpose.
Thank you, Peter, for that fine speech. We now move on straight away to Robert, if that's all right, to open the case for the opposition.
Well, let me start straight away by agreeing with Peter. I'm happy to talk about Mexit if people want to pose questions about it. But I don't think this has anything to do with the issue, really. Mexit has, of course, highlighted many of the issues that Peter has quite rightly raised. But what we're talking about here is the essence of the system that he addressed at the beginning and then right at the end there. I'd like to come back to his point about the democratically elected president. I think I'd also agree with him that I'd rather go to Legoland than Windsor Castle. But I mean, that's a matter of personal taste. I would reply to Peter's request for a democratically elected president with just 2 words. President Boris. I mean, he says he wants the people to choose who should lead them. I quite agree with all his objections to the arbitrary way in which the royal family is a relic in one way of the past. You can see it as a relic. You can also see it as history and the best of the past. After all, we did cut off our king's head in 1649. We did try 11 years of republic. We did bring back the monarchy in a rather different system, answerable to us. And when we look at the last test of public opinion as to the person that people wanted to lead the efficient element of our government, the executive element of our government, they chose Boris Johnson. Peter actually made a very interesting distinction. He said he doesn't want our head of government, the efficient head of government, to be the same as what's called constitutionally the dignified head of government. He's in fact proposing, interestingly, a system which is very close to monarchy. We have divided in our way of doing things in Britain, I think very efficiently, Peter seems to agree, between the executive government that we vote for and then the dignified, symbolic, or maybe not symbolic, head of state who is supposed to represent what we all agree about. So here I think there's another area of agreement between us. We are simply arguing tonight, it seems to me, about who should best represent Britain as a dignified, as a ceremonial head of state. And if we're, obviously the election recently involved politics. If we are asking now, who would the people of Britain elect tomorrow as their dignified head of state, not the person to run the government, but the person to represent us? Well, who do we vote for? President Lineker? President Janet Street Porter? I mean, by all means, let's discuss the monarchy, but let us also look at the alternatives. We agree, it seems, that we need somebody who, or a group of people maybe, who represent the values that we agree upon. I have to take issue with Peter's remark about the expense of the royal family. It's quite true. Why does the royal family doesn't need 6 palaces? It's the people who want to visit them that need 6 palaces. And when it actually comes to the statistics about value for money, well, it is true that the royal families of Europe are much smaller than ours and are much less expensive in that way. On the other hand, recent surveys have shown very conclusively that expensive though ours is, Peter would, of course, say, well, and not surprisingly, it has more members. But if you divide the expense by the number of members and the actual engagements they carry out, the most hardworking royal in Europe, who is judged best value for money at about £1 per head per taxpayer or something like that, I'm not quite sure of the exact figures, I can dig them out here. One of the advantages of this system is that one can sit at one's desk and shuffle papers, is actually Princess Anne. Princess Anne carries out 600 engagements a year, and she actually outstrips the kings of Belgium or the Scandinavian countries in terms of value for money. Also, Prince Charles is very hardworking. The Queen does lots of engagements, and so there are 2 sides to this question of value for money. But I think we have to rise above that. What we're looking at is who best represents our values. In that sense, I suppose I myself am disappointed by Brexit. I am disappointed that the British monarchy cannot include a mixed race figure, now 2 mixed race figures. It cannot include campaigners for social change, for women's rights. I think that's a challenge facing the monarchy in the future, although, of course, the more the monarchy goes in that direction, the less it will be the neutral sort of institution we seem to be agreeing that we need. I think I've done my 5 minutes. I look forward to discussing more later. I look forward to hearing the views of Graham, the head of this institution, which I greatly respect, Republic. I think true monarchists welcome all debate and challenge to the British monarchy. It's not a matter of privilege. It's not a matter of ancient inheritance. It's a matter of what vitally represents what people in Britain care about today.
Yeah, thank you very much. And firstly, to everybody watching, I hope you're all safe and well during this COVID. I started making notes on what Robert was saying, and I've got a long list of things that I want to pick up on. But I want to start by saying my original thoughts, really, which is that, there are 3 things that I think are an obstacle to people, or maybe a reason why people still put up with the monarchy or support it. People do think it's harmless. They think it's completely outside of politics and it doesn't get involved, doesn't cause any problems. I mean, that's not true, and I'll come back to that in a moment. They think it's good for the economy. As Peter said about tourism, there's been some bizarre, extraordinary figures bandied around about how much impact they have on the economy. None of that is true. And they think it unites the country, which is also a way of saying that everybody else likes it, so what could be wrong with it? Or everybody else likes it, so I'm not going to stick my head above the parapet. But I mean, you can't unite a country with an institution that most people are fairly disinterested in. So the main objections, really, I mean, firstly, there is a matter of principle. Now, Robert has talked about how this institution represents our values. It certainly does not represent our values. Our values are about equality, democracy. It's about being citizens and being active participants in our political space. It's not about being subjected to an imposition of a head of state and all of the symbolism that comes with a feudal institution that should have been got rid of a long time ago. I mean, it did occur to me, as Peter said, is it no longer fit for purpose? I mean, the Romans decided to get rid of the monarchy 2,500 years ago. So, it's not, realizing the monarchy is no good, it's not a new idea. It's never been any good. It has come out of violence and oppression. Kings and queens in the past were nothing more than dictators that used God as a justification for being there. And those are the values and principles that it still represents, even though they've been sanitized and diluted over time and to try and fit with the modern world. So our institutions should reflect our principles, which are about democracy and equality. Then you've got the palace itself. Now, the palace is not fit for purpose. It is, I was looking at Transparency International, which looks at corruption around the world, and their definition of corruption isn't far off some of what you can see in the palace. Incredibly secretive. Other historians have described it as more secretive than MI5 and CIA. Resistant to proper scrutiny, fighting for 10 years to stop journalists seeing letters that Charles was sending to government ministers, and routinely abusing public money. Now, this is the point about the cost. We've estimated at least £345 million a year. Now, you can get 17,000 new nurses for that. That is a very expensive institution, and no other institution in the country or in the world, as far as I know, is justified by dividing it by every man, woman and child in the country. It just doesn't work like that. You have £345 million, which we could spend on 17,000 nurses or police officers or teachers, but instead we spend it on 15 members of the royal household. And that is so high because they're routinely using that money on private travel, helicopter flights, charter flights. I mean, Charles even took a helicopter flight to Cambridge to meet climate scientists to lecture them on the importance of reducing CO2 emissions. So, I mean, the hypocrisy is quite startling. So, and then, of course, there is the interference behind closed doors. I mean, Charles is famous for this. It's not really believable to think that others haven't done the same. And they have demanded, not just, Charles obviously is famous for pushing his own political agenda, but they also push for their own interests. So they have lobbied successfully to have the Freedom of Information Act amended to make them more secretive, and they have lobbied successfully to introduce the sovereign grant, which is a very generous settlement and one which means that their costs keep going up without any good reason whatsoever. So there's the principle, and then there's the palace. It's not an institution that is fit for purpose, but then there's the politics of it, the constitution. And I want to pick up on an important point here, which Robert was suggesting that he and Peter are agreeing on the role of the head of state. But the role of the head of state, yes, it is mostly ceremonial, but it also has some important reserve functions. The President of Ireland, President of Germany, Italy, President of Greece, they have some reserve powers, such as formally appointing the Prime Minister, which is usually a formality, but can be an important role to play when there is a crisis of where Parliament can't decide who's going to be in government, and this has happened in places like Belgium, Spain, Italy, and Greece over the last 10 years. There's a role there to sign acts of Parliament into law, which is a mechanism for protecting the Constitution. And there have been times over the last 10 years where there has been a need for a head of state, and the Queen has made it very abundantly clear from just the weeks leading up to the 2010 election, when there was expected to be a hung parliament, right up to the prorogation of Parliament last year, where the Queen has been very clear that the only thing she'll ever do is what she's instructed by the Prime Minister. And, you know, she is damned if she is and damned if she isn't, because if she does anything independent of the Prime Minister, that's the problem, because she's a Queen, not a President. She's not accountable for those decisions. So the argument is that we have a parliamentary system where we elect our parliamentarians, all of them, both houses. We still have the Prime Minister, and we have a constitutional head of state, as they do in Ireland, as they do in Germany, in Greece and Italy. And that person then is representing our values, whilst also providing that backstop in case of a crisis or political paralysis. So, and the point is that the monarchy is a pretty shabby institution. It doesn't serve any serious purpose. It only really serves the interests of the politicians. And we just simply do have a good, functional, democratic alternative right there that we can take. But we don't, because we are constantly told that it makes us money. It doesn't. We're constantly told they do so much hard work. Well, they don't really. And I've done the figures as well. I've got a video on how hard they work on our YouTube channel. I mean, this is not hard work. Nurses work hard, doctors work hard, police officers work hard, even our MPs work hard. The royals do not. And just quickly, I wanted to pick up on a couple of the things that Robert said. I mean, he mentioned in passing that, it represents history and the best of our past. Well, I would say it represents part of our history and the worst of our past. It represents an institution and a class of people that we have constantly had to fight against in order to get the democratic rights and freedoms that we now enjoy. And the notion of President Boris, I would say this. Firstly, you're not going to get President Boris because it's a constitutional role and it's very unlikely he's going to stand. But if he did, then President Boris Johnson, if that's who we vote for, that's who we should have. Now, the idea that we should sneer at the choices of the electorate and that we should dismiss those choices as, uncouth or something that we don't respect, and that because we don't trust them to not vote Gary Lineker into the high office, that we should therefore deny them that right. Because at the bottom line, the very fundamental point is that by the end of this decade, probably maybe early next decade, we are going to get a new head of state. Now, the Queen is 94, and either we are going to be told as spectators in our democracy, it is going to be King Charles, and there's nothing you can do about it. And no doubt people like Robert will say, well, he's the best person for the job. He's great at it. He's been waiting in the wings for this job for so long. Or we can all turn around and say, well, you know what? We can actually have a vote. And how difficult is it to have a vote? Ireland do it, and they do it really well. They've had brilliant heads of state in Michael D. Higgins, Mary Robinson, Mary McAleese, and the opportunity of having that debate about which direction your country is going and what those values are that the president represents and who you want as head of state is also a powerful opportunity for the country. So I would say that, yes, absolutely, the monarchy has never been fit for purpose. There is a very clear, optimistic, exciting alternative on offer, and it's time that we threw this lot out and said, thank you very much, but we're going to move on into the 21st century.
So we're now going to move on to questions. We'll go to our first question, which is, do you think support for the monarchy is falsely equated with support or respect for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth? Would anyone like to take that?
Yes. If I heard right, the question is whether the support for the monarchy is tied up with the Queen. I mean, I think that a substantial amount of the support for the monarchy is tied up with the Queen. The Prince Charles simply does not carry the same level of respect. And I think that that's going to be part of their problem in the future. I mean, going back, talk briefly about Megxit. I think that part of the issue that it raises is that, they are running out of people who are remotely recognizable or interesting. And, in 15 years' time, it will just be Charles and William. And they're not the most inspiring people. And I think that, and more importantly, they are people who the public is quite used to seeing being criticized and challenged in a way that the Queen never has been. So I think that's going to make a big difference. But I mean, on public opinion, I think it is high but shallow. I mean, we've done polling around the time of Harry's wedding, showing that most people are fairly indifferent to it on the whole. But when asked, would you want to get rid of it? They say, well, no, why would we? You know, because they believe that it's good for tourism, that everyone else likes it and it's harmless. You know, it's not. We're not a nation of royalists in a state of rapture every time we see the Queen on the TV. We are a nation of people that are fairly indifferent, and then there is a sizable minority on either side who are enthusiastic for or against.
Can I come in there and on the other side, but also yet again agreeing with what Graham says? I suppose he and Peter would say that the longevity and hard work of the Queen rather distorts and sentimentalizes our feelings. They would say too much in favor of the institution. But I would say, well, you know, if the institution has produced a person who has won national respect, who has commanded national respect, there in itself is an argument for the institution. Throughout the range, you know, the months of this dreadful COVID experience that we've been through, who is the one person who has made a speech, who has stood up and expressed thoughts and hopes and values that has won everybody's, most people's affection? It's the Queen. You know, sadly, she can't do it again. She's done it once. We need something for the second spike. But that speech she made in the spring was understandably plastered. You know, I don't know who decides who goes up in Piccadilly Circus. Maybe it's a commercial decision. Anyway, there she was for days, raising national spirits. Now, yes, it's irrational. When I spoke earlier about, you know, the fact that we cut off the king's head, I said that sort of flippantly. And then I hear Peter and Graham going back to the inequities and wickedness and feudal nature of the monarchy. Quite true. And that's what we ended in 1649. And we tried a republic, you know, and it didn't work. But the important thing is the monarchy that we brought back was our choice. And it remains our choice.
Well,
It's not subjected to popular vote because that's not the nature of it. I would not for a minute suggest that Prince Charles should be our head of state because he's the best qualified for the job. No, I would say Prince Charles should be our head of state because he's the next product of this weird system that actually quite a lot of people endorse and like. And I also disagree that there's nobody coming up. I mean, you'll just say this is all the work of the wicked capitalist media. But the amount of times in the last few months that William and Kate have been plastered over the front of the newspapers to raise people's spirits is quite extraordinary. And that reflects a commercial reality and a popular reality. So there again, yes, the Queen may be an exception. Well, she's not, because I would suggest, I've got lots of things to say in my book to the discredit of William and Kate. That's not what we're talking about now. But in popular opinion, I can tell you, my mailbag here, my emails are full of angry criticisms of me for daring to suggest that William and Kate are not perfect. I would say, and again, Peter and Graham, I'm sure, would say this reflects a deficiency on our part, that we have a hunger in this country, you'll say we should grow out of it, for the sort of figureheads the royal family provide. I would agree with you, Charles doesn't do that very well, but whether you like them or not personally, actually, if you look at popular culture as reflected in the popular press, then William and Kate do reflect in these troubled days, a beacon for hope, strangely, illogically though it may be, that Boris Johnson and the political system hasn't reached. And with all due respect to Mary McAleese and the wonderful presidents that Ireland has produced, you can't be sure of that coming from the alternative system. And at the end of the day, if there was some mechanism I mean, I'd love to see a vote. Do people want their next head of state to be Prince William or President Lineker? I'd love to see the result of that vote, because I have no doubt that people would go for William.
So the question is from Jonathan Terrence, and he asks, this is particularly to the proposition. So it appears you might have suggested that there's some sort of conflict between constitutional monarchy and sort of social democracy. But isn't that rebutted by the experience in the Nordic countries, that there seems to be quite little opposition to monarchy there?
Yeah, I think I'd just like to pick up the point. If we had an elected head of state, I would say it would be fine for Prince Charles to stand for election. And if people voted for him, I would accept that. I just think that people should have a right to make that choice. That is what democracy is about. It strikes me as extraordinary that the highest office in the land, the most important revered position of head of state, is not subject to public support and accountability. And of course, you could say that we have been very lucky to have a good queen. Whatever criticisms people can make, some people would say, well, Elizabeth has been a good queen. But that's just the luck of the draw. In the 1930s, we had a king, Edward VIII, who was a crypto-Nazi sympathizer. So under a monarchical system, you may get a very good person, but you may also get a very bad person. And the trouble is, you cannot do anything about it. You're stuck with that person. And the principle is, why should it be that the most ignorant, stupid, immoral royal is more fit to be head of state than the wisest, most compassionate and ethical commoner? That just doesn't seem right. Now back to the question. What was the question again? Sorry.
The experience of the Nordic countries with having monarchies and being successful social democracies, does that, with quite little opposition to their monarchies, does that not provide some sort of counter-argument to the points you made?
I think the success of the Nordic countries is very much rooted not in the fact they have monarchies, but they have better political systems. They have a system of proportional representation where they don't have minority governments. They have governments which have popular support, majority support, whereas in Britain, we've never had a government with majority support since 1931. Every single government has been based on a minority of the popular vote. So in those Nordic countries with proportional representation, they have governments that reflect the full spectrum of public opinion, they have parliaments that reflect the full spectrum of public opinion, and governments that command majority support from the voting public. And they also have much stronger traditions of social justice and equality compared to Britain. I don't think the monarchy has anything to do with it because, of course, in those countries, the monarchy doesn't have power. They are also constitutional monarchies.
Graham, would you like to chip in there?
Well, you still have the problem of the monarchy. I mean, a couple of things really. I mean, the Nordic countries get raised quite a lot, and people say, well, they're successful and prosperous and equal and all the rest of it. But I mean, their monarchies have survived because they have been largely stripped bare of a lot of the nonsense that ours still has, and they are stable and successful, prosperous countries. So the pressure to get rid of those monarchies isn't what it might otherwise be. They aren't successful because they've got monarchies. The monarchies are still there because they've been pretty successful. Which is not to say that they are perfect utopias. I mean, they have plenty of their own social and economic problems. But the British monarchy is the British monarchy. That's the one we've got, and that's the one which we have to look at. And I think that the notion that this system has given us a monarch who everyone respects and all the rest of it, so isn't that a great system? No, a lot of the respect for the Queen is because she has been shielded from scrutiny and criticism, and that people up until not that many years ago who tried to challenge the Queen were shouted down, hounded, threatened, and all the rest of it. It has been in the past very difficult to challenge the monarch. And so there is this sort of deference and sycophancy which has created this illusion of someone who has never put a foot wrong. Quite frankly, if the Queen had been facing election every 7 years, no, she wouldn't still be there. Longevity in public office is usually a sign of something going wrong. And it's in this country, it's because we don't insist on elections, we don't insist on accountability, and we don't allow proper scrutiny. And I think that, I get plenty of emails in my inbox, people getting angry with me for being rude about the royals, but that doesn't really tell me much. Opinion polling does tell me quite a lot, which is that most people are fairly indifferent to the whole thing. As was the case with the William and Kate wedding, as well as the Harry and Meghan wedding. And just very quickly, I mean, the Cromwell thing, your history is a little bit rusty there, Robert, because, I mean, you know, we didn't bring back the royals. There was a counter-revolution that brought back the royals, led by Charles II. It was an incredibly cruel and bloody and violent counter-revolution. And it was some years later that we had the so-called Glorious Revolution, when we parliamentarians invited the Dutch king to come over and stage another coup, which was done on the promise that it would then become a constitutional monarchy. But I mean, it's, you know, the idea that this is all done with the popular will is farcical. I mean, you know, Britain's only really been a full democracy for 100 years since we decided to introduce universal suffrage, including the votes for women. So, you know, this is an institution that predates Britain being a full democracy, and we've never really had this opportunity to properly scrutinise this institution, because for most of that time, obviously we then had the war, and then we had the Queen and all the sort of nationalism and whatever it is around that. And it's only really been in the last 20 years that the debate has started to sort of allow more diverse voices, but those voices still remain largely marginalised, even though they are representing millions of people in the country who think that we should get rid of the monarchy, and of course millions more who don't really care that much, but are open to persuasion. So,
well, I've got to come. You've just insulted my history, and you're very free to do that. Thank you for reminding me about the Glorious Revolution. Yes, you talk about scrutiny. I can't think of much fiercer scrutiny than the full-scale trial of state into the crimes of the monarch, who then gets executed. And as I remember, the restoration of Charles II was not really a bloody event, and certainly the Glorious Revolution once again reflected the people choosing this king. All this talk about the Scandinavian monarchies and how wonderfully democratic they are, absolutely true. I think there's a lot to be said for Peter's arguments for the wider sort of representation that their parliaments present us with. But at the end of the day, they have the power to remove their monarchies, and they don't. The idea that in the 21st century, the monarchy sits upon us as some feudal imposition we can't get rid of is just simply contradicted by the evidence. If you're going to talk to me about the British psychology and our failure to make an imaginative leap, I'll go with you on that. But the idea that this imposition, this institution is imposed on us by MI5 or something like that, it's there because we, in all our fallibility, like it. And that may well reflect badly on us, but they are not there with armed guards. I mean, the armed guards are purely ceremonial to encourage the tourists. And the idea, anybody who's been past Buckingham Palace, well, before COVID, the idea that they doesn't encourage tourism is absolutely ridiculous. Look at the crowds that gather around Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace. But that, incidentally, is not my justification for why we should have it. Sorry, I've spoken too much. Let's have another question, perhaps.
We've got a slightly different question here, which is just on Megxit and whether the panel thinks that Megxit highlights a particular problem in Britain, not just in the royal family, but in the press and in the public, which is that of racism and sexism. So, what does the panel think about that? And we'll go to Peter next, I suppose. That's if you have something to say.
Well, I think it's undoubtedly true that Meghan and Harry have not conformed to the traditional royal roles. They have brought a whole new style and way of doing things. They don't want to sit by the same decorum and same traditional neutrality that the royals have shrouded themselves in. So undoubtedly, this has ruffled royal feathers. And we know from some of the evidence come out that the senior royals, including the Queen, were not happy with some of the things that Harry and Meghan did, and wanted to rein them in. They've decided to go their own separate way, sort of, not entirely, but sort of. And I think that a lot of the issues around Meghan in particular do appear to be around misogyny and racism. Not necessarily, the barefaced misogyny and racism that you get from, from macho toxic men, but it's more subtle, and we certainly saw plenty of evidence of racism and sexism in some of the social media, or a lot of the social media posts directed at Meghan, and the fact that she wasn't British, the fact that she was an American. And I think that is an issue, but I don't think it's substantive to the fundamental issue about whether the royal family is fit for purpose.
So I'll just throw one more point into the mix, and then I suppose each of you can have a few minutes to go through and gather what we've talked about and sort of address your final case, as it were. And that's the point about one of our members has made, Lucy Jackson of University College, and she asks, if we were to have an elected head of state, would the issue not be that it would be an incredibly politically charged race? In this country, what we've seen, particularly with the 2016 referendum, I'm sure, is quite an emotive one that pits brother against brother, mother against son. It splits through families. Would it not be the same for a head of state election? And we'll start with Graham, please.
I would say that it's the opposite, really. I mean, firstly, there's nothing wrong with politics. I mean, people often talk about it as if it's a dirty word, but politics is how we do things in a democratic society. In fact, it's how you do things in an undemocratic society, but you just do it more fairly in a democratic one. And the royals are also political, but we just don't know exactly what they're doing behind closed doors. But the experience of going through an election for a constitutional head of state can actually be quite cathartic. And if you look at the last seriously contested election on Ireland, which was 2011, there were 7 candidates from a number of different political backgrounds, and they all knew that they were standing for a constitutional role which required impartiality, it required a certain level of seriousness and so on. And it was they still had televised debates, and there was a lot of discussion about what sort of head of state they wanted. And there was an opportunity for that decision to reflect Ireland as it was going through a number of social and economic challenges and changes. And they were able to make an incredibly good decision in Michael D. Higgins, as they had done with Mary Robinson and Mary McAleese. No system is going to be perfect. And yes, if there is suddenly an election which becomes contentious, so be it. Then we get through that and we move on. If the head of state turns out to be corrupt or a liar or whatever, then you have a mechanism for either impeaching them or you throw them out of the next election. If a monarch is like that, we have really no way of doing anything about it. And arguably monarchs have been like that, corrupt and dishonest and secretive and all the rest of it. But it all gets swept under the carpet. So yeah, I think that, and this is part of my problem with the monarchy, is that it constantly gets British people compromising on our democratic values, because we have to make space for the monarchy and for the lords and for all this nonsense which has no place in a democratic society. We shouldn't be, can we really trust the people to have an election? Can we really trust them who they're going to vote for? Is it going to be difficult? Is it going to be cantankerous and contested? Yes, quite possibly. Democracy in society is difficult sometimes. That's life. That is not a reason to whitewash it all and pretend it's all one big, nice, fluffy fairy tale because we've put this sort of weird feudal layer of nonsense across it called the monarchy.
Well, I just certainly heard a very articulate and sensible and rather appealing case made by Graham. And I must say I hadn't studied the Irish presidential election in the way you've just described it. And I think that sounds rather impressive. And honestly, if that system were to come to Britain, I would have no problem with it. And we live in a democracy. Good, more power to your elbow, Graham, and push for that. The point is that at the moment we have this system. Our particular motion tonight is about whether after Brexit the royal family is still fit for purpose. I totally agree with what Peter said. I think the fact that the royal family as it stands cannot accommodate the personality and ideas and nature of a mixed race American is a failure on the part of the monarchy. I don't say it's not fit for purpose, but I would certainly agree it makes it less fit for purpose. I would just say that there seems to be some sort of effort to heal this breach inside the royal family, and what an important breach it is to heal, if only because of this role, which I know Peter and Graham don't agree with, of this old-fashioned way of term of setting an example. Several times we've heard about the problems of corrupt kings, as if somehow Elizabeth II is rather an exception. We did have an unfortunate monarch in 1936, but we're only talking about 1 year, and one way or another the system got rid of him. Again, when Peter was talking about the problems with Meghan, he quite rightly focused on the misogyny and racism of social media. It wasn't the royal family actually who kicked her out. She was welcomed very warmly. The wedding you've been so slighting about in Windsor Castle, a most eloquent Afro-American preacher who, as he has since said, he could hear his slave ancestors talking to him, and the idea that the British monarchy could bring in that sort of dimension, I think, is tremendously inspiring. You will now say I'm shooting myself in the foot because in some way she's been excluded, and the independence of mind that Harry represents now has also been excluded. I'm not saying the institution is perfect, but I am saying it's just about fit for purpose. And if it's not, we live in a democracy. Let's put it to the test in some way, and let's see again whether the people vote for Prince William or for President Lineker.
We've just heard that the purpose of the monarchy is to represent the British people and values. But how can one single family do that? How is that possible in a system where our head of state is passed down from one generation to the next through one particular exclusive and very privileged family? I mean, I think we need to face up to the fact that we live in a multicultural society today, and I find it very offensive that under the monarchical system, it is impossible in the foreseeable future to imagine that there could ever be a non-white British head of state, because the head of state resides with the Windsor family, and all the key people for the foreseeable 2 or 3 generations at least are white. And therefore that automatically precludes any black or Asian or Chinese or whatever British citizen, no matter how well they would be for the job, it precludes them from ever holding that post. It is racially exclusive by definition. Not by intent, I accept, but by definition, it means that we cannot have a non-white head of state for some generations to come. And I find that very insulting to Black and Asian Britons, many of whom would be fine heads of state if the British people would choose to select them under an elected head of state. So I think these are other issues that we also need to consider. But what we've done tonight is have a debate. We've discussed a range of different issues and dimensions. And I would hope that out of this, we will recognize, as we do, that this is an issue that merits debate, that the monarchy is not a closed issue, that we can debate it. And there are arguments which do suggest that alternatives to monarchy are not only possible, but in many cases desirable as well. So I would urge you to vote to say that the monarchy is still not fit for purpose.
I thank Peter and the three of us in this room will give a round of applause for all of our speakers. I'm sure those at home will join us with a virtual round of applause through the airwaves. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Just a note on voting. Voting will be done not by acclamation, not by division.